Well, as you know, I do offer to make films especially for people. It often gives me more inspiration for new titles, and one of you subscribers has kindly asked me to make you a video especially about the use of brushes. Well, on my paintings obviously I already show this in more detail in each painting. So in the watercolours and in the acrylics and in the oils I am using the brushes for those purposes, but in this case I'm going to do a short film, especially on the different uses of watercolour brushes and why. And the different sort of brushes I have and why I've collected them. Now with the oil brushes and with the acrylic brushes I need a much smaller set. I don't need as many special effects. I can still use sponges, I can use rollers as we've seen in my paintings. There's all sorts of different ways of making marks with my fingers and so on. But with watercolour, on that surface of paper, we do need a series of different brushes, I feel. So I'm going to show you in more depth all of the brushes in these and what their uses are. And in one painting we're going to use several of them. And we're going to discuss the fact that they are different on different papers as well. Obviously a smooth paper or a medium paper or a rough paper is very, very different for each brush because you get into the surface of it. You've got a rough texture. If you dry brush over the surface, it's going to just touch the surface of the paper. If you have a softer brush, it goes into the surface and so on. So we're going to discuss the use of why we've got these different brushes and with those different papers as well. Not canvases, just papers and just watercolour in this particular film. So here we are then, two separate cases of brushes that I like to carry for almost every use. Here we have the magic sponges. You can buy these quite cheaply from even the pound shop. Very useful for lifting paint away, especially on a paper that has absorbed it slightly more. We've got our pencils in for drawing. We've got a Chinagraph pencil here for the very dark wax drawing and snow scenes and so on, where we can put watercolour over the top and it won't move. I've got my clay shapers here, which are very useful for putting on masking fluid because it rubs off easily. So rubber tipped clay shapers of various types and sizes, right down to nice small wedge shaped ones. So that's for masking fluid. And for the masking fluid we also have special masking fluid brushes in here. That's these little white fellows here, which don't clog up with the masking fluid. We can actually rub it off more easily and wash it off with water afterwards. You don't want to use ordinary brushes for that. So masking fluid tools. I also have in here also this little pen set to go with the masking fluid. By adjusting that, the amount of masking fluid in between here is increased, so I can do larger areas of masking fluid with that. Quite a useful little mapping pen. Here's a Matthew Palmer texture brush. A nice one for doing stippling. You see there's a slight angle to it, great for mosses and more coarser textural work. And of course we will need sponges for that as well, and we've got various types of sea sponges here which are all different in texture and will all give me a different texture when printed on. So we've got texture brushes there, the Matthew Palmer one for instance, and then sponges themselves. These brushes are very useful, much cheaper but very similar again. You see the fluffy end, great for doing mosses and stone textures, flat ended, very bristly. You couldn't paint a thin line with them, that's for sure, but you do get nice furry effects or stippled effects. And talking about furry effects, we've got these brushes here which are called rakes of various different sizes and types, look. And you'll notice that on these we've got narrow blades and fine rakes, and right down to almost a flat, but it is still a rake as you can see. So rakes for doing grasses, for doing textural fine lined work on trees and so on. Very useful, the rake brushes. Whilst we're on rakes we can talk about fans as well, which are also very useful for doing tree twigs and branches on winter trees and effects of lines at the end. They were originally invented for blending clouds in skies with oil paint, but we actually find them very, very useful for making either for pine trees and fir trees by just patting them across, or for using a little bit of wet into wet or wet on dry at the ends of branches, winter tree branches and so on. We'll look at using those. We've got obviously our ordinary standard round brushes, and they can be harder or softer, and there's a difference in using a harder and softer brush in the way that it will go into the paper. We've got our hakes, beautiful, nice, soft Ron Ransom hakes here for doing big washes and loose work. Again, they can be broken up when slightly dry to give textures and grasses, as well as giving flat washes. We'll discuss that. We've got our wash mops, our oval mops, one of my favourite brushes. In this case I keep 3 Pro Art ones of small, medium and large. These are great for putting on flat washes or painting wet into wet or wet next to wet paintings. With this or the hake and a fine brush or rigger, I can do almost an entire painting. Very, very useful indeed. And then we come to our flats of various sizes. See here we've got 2 different flats. Again, they're slightly stiffer, the ones I use. You can get softer flats, but I've got these harsher flats for deliberately doing dry brushwork, especially street scenes. Very good for dragging across the surface of rough paper and making wet into wet or wet on dry street scenes, reflections and so on. Especially when the scene is actually wet itself, so the reflections of light on water. Then the sword brushes, called swords in this case because of the sword or the knife shape. You can get very long swords for doing straight lines and so on, but these ones again are slightly stiffer. I've got more control with these, and they're great for figure painting because I can twist and move them around at different angles and flick them, especially for the limbs on figures, legs and arms and so on. So sword brushes, but a little bit stiffer this time. It does matter as to the stiffness of the brush you're using. Right up to larger hakes here, and the smaller flats not just useful for dry brush work but also for painting in little squares. You want a round mark, you want a round brush, you want a fan shaped mark, you want a fan shaped brush, you want little tiny lines of grasses, then these rakes. But if you want a small flat area, say for instance of a window, so you're doing a series of say 6 windows in a building, then you want small square brushes for those things. So we've got horses for courses, we've got brushes for each course. Well, that's the basics of my brushes. Oh yes, I've also got here a toothbrush, which is great for splattering, and some larger brushes here like this one for splattering as well, because we can just take those, we can either flick them, or we can splatter them, or we can bash them against something to make splattering effects. So 3 different ways there. And that is the basics of my set of brushes. I don't need many more in here. I should also mention rigger brushes for long fine lines and fine work, and of course pens, pen and ink. These are the easiest way to have pens nowadays, and they can be used for effects like this as pen and wash, or pen and watercolour, and pen and gouache, and pen and acrylic even. Let's now see how we can actually use all of these brushes differently, shall we? And the painting I'm going to use to demonstrate this one is this rather nice picture at Conques in France. Conques is a lovely cathedral, very old medieval cathedral village high in the mountains in the Aveyron, and we've got here this lady coming through it, figure sitting lurking in the background, and I'm using a very rough paper, an extra rough paper, deliberately for this purpose. We're going to leave a lot of white paper sparkling in this one, deliberately, so that you can see the use of brushes and dry brush work, how we can get a brush to go into it, how we can do some dry brush work, and a little bit of texturing, but not very much. I'm going to do that separately. Before I start to demonstrate brushes, we need to talk about the surface we're going to paint upon, in this case the paper. And with watercolour paper we have 3 surfaces, rough, knot and hot pressed, and then different thicknesses or weights of paper as well. Obviously the effect that the paint has on and in the paper is very important. The importance for brushwork is that into a rough paper, seen here on the top left and the centre, the paint sinks into the paper so it forms ridges, or it is on the surface of the paper, the top edge surface of the paper, as you bring the brush across, so we get more texture that way. The smoother the paper, the less the texture. Let me try and demonstrate that to you now with some simple graphics, where we can look at how a brush would come across the surface side on of the paper, and how it would either sink into those ridges or remain on the top. Then we'll look at some examples. Imagine that you're looking edge onto the paper here. So we have the top surface of the paper as a rough paper, these little nodules. And if we try painting a brush across that, the paint is either going to go right into all of that and cover it completely, so we need a lot of liquid, or it's going to drop into those areas and leave the top areas exposed slightly, or just touch the top areas only. What it can't do is what I'm showing here, is just go across the surface as a film. It's got to either just touch the top surfaces or drop within those. This would mean that it would leave a surface texture of either little dots on the surface raised bits of the paper or as it sinks into the paper. And so it would give a very fine texture depending on the fineness of the paper and how rough it was. If it was very liquid and completely filled the surface of the paper, or painted completely over it, then you wouldn't have any texture at all, as on a smooth paper, just a plain surface like this. This is where a stiff brush comes in handy. Here's an example of how a stiff brush taken across the surface of the paper, only touching the very surface texture, leaves the texture on top, doesn't go into those recesses of the paper. That will give you the textured surface of dry brush, which gives you this. If we use a softer wash brush or oval mop and we drop the paint, liquid paint, right into that surface, then we're not going to have any texture at all unless it granulates. Granulating is when the paint sinks into the textured surface, so you get a much more even surface like this. Okay, let's start off looking at different brushes now then. Here we have a rake brush, and let's look at the sort of marks we can make with the rake brush. As you would expect with the word saying rake, we've got a serrated edge to the brush. So if we simply paint a line, we get this, which is great for doing grasses, for instance, like this, in different colours. Let's just do that as an example. We'll take a light colour first, some yellow, some aureolin yellow, and just paint that in. Then we'll take a little green, just paint that across the top, and a little of the deeper blue coming into that, and you can see how quickly we can make a grass effect. We can also use it for stippling, so you can make the ends of the grasses a little bit of brown in this case, and we'll just put some of the ends of the grasses over the top. Look how quickly we can get a grass effect like that. Great fun. So there we have the rake brush. I want to move on now to the rigger, this long fine brush, which allows us to paint long fine lines. So you can paint very long thin lines, or by pushing harder and softer, hard, then bringing off softer, fine lines. So it's great for something like twigs, branches. You can see the fine texture. We can get a little paint as long as you want. So very useful brush for painting long, fine lines. And as I say, by painting it a little bit hard, by pushing a little bit harder at first and then coming off softer, we can get nice grass effects or twig effects, painting from thick to thin for twigs and branches. So that was the rigger. Next, let's look at a fan brush, originally designed for making clouds and blending cloud effects in oil paint. Now a fan has a multitude of uses. You can have it doing little strokes very similar to the rake brush, or we can do short strokes like that with it to give textures and grasses. And we can also use it with a bit more paint to give the effects of the end of branches and twigs. So let us say that we use now our rigger brush to paint some trees, and we came in then with the end of the branches like this. This is in winter time, these trees. So we've got these end of the branches, and then we come at the end of it and we just paint in with the fan the ends of the twigs of the winter branches like this. And you see how easily that can be used to produce texture and the end of winter branches. So that was the fan brush. And whilst we're on fan brushes, let's take a different one, and we'll use the same technique, but this brush is slightly less spaced. As you can see, it doesn't break up as much at the end, or we can make it a bit drier and break it up a bit more. So different fan brushes that break up more will give you different effects. Let's say I wanted to use my fan brush, for instance, to paint some fir trees, and by using it the other way up, this way up, I can quite simply paint fir tree marks around like this. To get the effect of fir trees coming up. Let's say for instance I wanted to paint some fir trees or pine trees. I'll just take a bit of brown and we'll paint that up here through, and then I can take my rigger at the end of that. I'll take a little bit of blue in this case for instance and just paint coming around there, look, that blue. You can imagine all the different effects we could do. We could do it coming across if we wanted, like that. Take some green now, we'll just come into those to get the pine trees. If we wanted fir trees, we could come around in this direction lifting upwards. So you can see how we can get either fir or pine trees. Take a little darker colour, a little deeper blue, just to darken into that. Get our fir trees, or if it was pine trees, we could come across them like this. So just giving you an idea of how we could do fir and pine trees. A little bit darker into there for fun, and look how we can get these lovely effects of things coming across, or we can get them in bunches coming sideways on, as with pine trees. Now at the moment we're using light to dark. Let's just deliberately take some slightly opaque colour and drop that in with this. Now it isn't just the use of the brush, it's the use of colours as well. Now I want to come to the use of flats. Now if we use a flat brush, and we just use it as a pattern even, to take a little brown and blue, and I simply paint in some blocks of squares like this, we can have the effect of windows or stones. So there we go, and we can use that brush flat on or sideways. And there we have a window. Quite easily. Now we can use it heavily. This is a knot paper, or we can use it as a dry brush, just dragging it across. Look how we get that effect there. So we're using that dry brush, or pressing more heavily to push the paint in. Dry brush is using the brush with less paint and just dragging it over the surface like this. Same way we could do it across there as a dry brush, just to bring some shading across. So we can use it to either place a shape in, or we can use, being a slightly stiffer flat brush, we can use it to drag across the surface, which is very useful for doing things like reflections. For instance, I'm just going to use a little sword brush, do a quick figure. Here we are, just paint him in. So we'll start with his head, just a little bit of red for fun. A little bit of his head here. Have a couple of hands in a moment. Let's give him a blue top. Just quick, very simple, very simple little figure. Just a quick little figure. Here we go. Arms, a bit deeper blue again. We'll do some ultramarine. A couple of legs, just flicked in with the sword brush. Just why I love the sword so much. And then we'll have just keep the whole thing simple. Now if I want to use that dry brush again, or I could use a flat, I can use the sword dry brush and just drag it down to give a bit of reflection, or I can come back to my flat and I can drag that down to give reflection in the same way, and across, down. So you see how we can use the flats to give dry brush work quite simply. A little bit more stronger, a little bit stronger in the colour, a little bit down on the edges there, a piece over the surface. We've got a figure in the rain. I'm going to move on now to the swords, quite deliberately. This is a sword brush then. This is a fairly small one. You see it's got a blade to it. Normally the blade is slightly more one-sided than the other, like that. Here's a larger sword brush to give you a better idea of that. Let's just look at this matter of painting figures with them again, because what I've said to you is how beautifully the sword brush allows itself to be used at different angles. So let's just take a couple of figures here. We'll take this one with a red top. Let's give her a quick dress here. Very, very simple shapes. Keep our figures simple. How we can just twist this brush around to give the shapes we need. A little bit of yellow ochre for our arm there, a bit of a leg showing. We'll just do a green top for this fella. Just a couple of marks. I'm making this up out of my head. A bit of green in there. Now some ultramarine. And we can just flick those legs down with the sword. You can do this with a round brush in the same way, but the sword allows me to twist it round, look, and use it at whatever angle I like. Do the same with her. Get a couple of feet here, twist it round, can make her face darker, a little bit of hair on him, and just stylise. We've almost got a couple of figures. We can just twist this brush how we want. We can use it that way, this way. And we've almost got a couple of figures there, just impressionistically, just very, very quickly there. And that's the use of the sword, we can twist it and move it as we want. So a very versatile brush, great for painting figures with. And this is on a very small scale. We come down to the round brushes now. You can have these in all sizes, from very large to very small. And again, you can get softer ones and harder ones. This one is a nice soft sable, so it will allow me to paint both thinly as a wash across, especially with a larger brush. We can get a round brush that's a wash brush and softer, or it will allow me to paint in more detail with the tip of the brush as finely as I like. And remember that with a brush we can make the brush into a blade by flattening it. So if I flatten that blade out, I can paint very, very finely by just using the tip of the blade to see how fine that mark is. Or I can use the other side of the blade and I can paint a fatter line by pressing harder or going from hard to thin. So round brushes for fine details, for fine marks, probably the most versatile of the brushes. But again, it depends upon whether you have a hard or a soft one, for doing washes or for doing fine details. Then for doing textures, I've got this Matthew Palmer brush and also another textural brush there. Let's show you how differently they work. We'll take the Matthew Palmer first and a little bit of Quimpertram Gold. And we'll just texture that in down here by pushing down, and it gives us this lovely mossy effect. Again, if I use it with a bit darker and drag it, there's the moss texture. I can also drag it downwards to get very, very fine grasses or moss. If I use the other one next to it, and I take the same dark, again it's slightly heavier, very, very similar, and again I can use it for texturing as well. So these brushes would be no good for painting a fine line, would they? Because obviously you can't paint a fine line with them, but very useful for textures. Right, next I want to look at splattering and how we can do splattering. We've got an ordinary toothbrush. If I just dip that into some Prussian blue and I flick it, we can get this effect, a nice fine splatter for snow. Or we can stipple with it the same way. If I take an ordinary flat brush, one of my slightly harder brushes, again I can flick this. I can make effects with that, a different splatter again. Or I can tap it over my finger like that to get a splatter. Or I can use a much larger, softer brush to get a splatter. In this case I'm going to use a hake and just fling it on. Great big blobs, great big splatters that we can get that way. Or again I can tap it across something to get a splatter that way. Now, whilst on the subject of washes, here's the hake and here's the oval mop again. Let's just show what we can do with those on a slightly larger piece of, on a slightly larger. We're going to start with the mop and we'll talk about glazing. The mop is very useful for doing washes and glazes. You put a simple wash down here of yellow. If I paint wet into wet, I can now bring some red into that. So we've got wet into wet, or we've got wet next to wet like that. So wash brushes, very useful brush, the oval mop, because not only can I paint wet into wet like this and do my glazes and washes, I can also use that brush, as you can see now, in such a versatile way. I can use it side on, I can use it as texture, I can use it finely for the tip, or I can use it fat. I can also dry it out a bit and break it up slightly so that the end is slightly broken to give myself textures like this for grasses and for trees and so on. So very versatile. Moving on in a similar way to my hake brush, I'll take some cerulean blue and I'll paste that down in the same sort of way. Nice big brush. I can take deep into that as well. I can do graduated washes. I can add colour in, wet into wet the same way. I can use it sideways on to give me textures for trees and so on, like this. You could use the tip of it, look, very, very useful. And I can break the end up, as I did before, just now. I can break the end up like that, dry it out, to give myself textures like this, look. And this is fantastic for trees and things. So I'll come right into that one and we can come around with that. So both of these brushes will do these sorts of textures, and both are very, very versatile. You can say we could drag that for grasses, we can make it more broken, and we can make all the sorts of effects we want. Now Ron Ransom, for instance, as an artist, creates all his paintings with just the one hake and a rigger. It's possible to use the oval mops and a round brush to do an entire painting. Now of course remember that at any time we like, we can also lift out with the brush. So I've just dried off this brush, it's just damp. I can come back into here and I can lift this out with the brush by just drying off the brush each time, as I can with the magic sponges. We can take that and we can lift out with the sponge. We can also take out from any dry area that we want as well. And we can use tissue for the same. So we can put paint on and we can lift it off, and then we can go back whenever we like, when it's still wet or when it's dry, to paint in more effects and more details. And these lovely effects we can get, almost misty there, of the wet into damp. Of course it depends how wet your paper is as to when you add your painting, as to how far it'll spread, how far it'll be soft, and so on. But we're painting wet next to wet, we're blending, we're painting wet into wet, painting wet on dry. All of these are different effects which each brush will behave differently in. So you can see perhaps now why I use so many brushes. Then of course we've got masking fluid we can use as well to leave light areas. Finally, last but not least, apart from using China Craft pencils and stick and ink, let's look at a pen. Because a pen, you can get brush pens now as well, but this is an ordinary Profi pen. Of course we can do pen and ink work with this one, like the one I'm going to show you with the young lady on it, which has had watercolour afterwards. These are waterproof pens, so you can get them in different thicknesses. You can do textural work with them, or you can do lines with them, and because they're waterproof, as soon as they're dry you can paint over them. So if I just take a little bit of yellow now, I can go across that. But if I put water on there already, just dampen that surface, just take it back a bit so it is only damp, and I put pen into that, the pen will actually spread slightly. In this case it's given me a pinky colour, and then I can work over that later as well to get my darker blacks. So we can put watercolour over the darks afterwards. Right, so there's the basics of my little demonstration. We've used the rake brush, we've used the rigger, we've used textural brushes, we've used the hake and we've used the wash, we've used fan brushes, we've used round brushes, we've used square brushes, we've used sword brushes, and we've even flick paint on, even the pens at the end. Now let's go ahead and use just a few of these brushes on an actual painting to give you an idea of how it works on a paper surface. Right, here we are ready to go then. Jar of water, palette of paints, the two sets of brushes, and we'll choose these accordingly and start on this picture. Now again, I want to work fairly loosely into this, and I want a lot of nice dry brush work at the end of it. So let's start with some of those smaller details first of all. To say I want to work nice and loose, so I'll take a nice little round brush at first here, and I want to put in some of these flower areas. So I want some of the very light yellows. I'm going to start with my aureolin yellow and just work out where some of this is coming nice and loose, nice and light. Plenty of white paper showing this time, so I'm going to be doing a lot of this dry brush. First of all here into the bits of yellow light that are shining through here. Aureolin yellow, a lovely light cool yellow coming through there. A lot of white paper, they say, to leave behind this time. We're going to put our light colours in first, so wherever these light colours are. I want to be a bit more golden now, so I'm going to move across to a chrome yellow and add that in, wet into here. just tickling it in with the end of my brush and letting this light, lovely light, shine into the edge of that tree. Already I'm making the light. I don't paint with paint, I paint with light. That's how I like to think of it anyway. So all the way down there. Now the other side here, got it much lighter. I'm going to take a little bit of turquoise and very thinly just bring some turquoise through here, down this side, very light, just so painting with light, just letting that come down wet into wet to give the light effects here at first, right through there, right through here, up into there, plenty of colour, let that come through. And then into that I'm going to bring my aureolin yellow again and make some very light greens with the aureolin yellow, bringing it into these turquoises. If it's slightly in shade here, again that aureolin yellow coming up, put my lights in now through here. So I'm going to leave this glowing through later on. Aureolin yellow, little touch of that turquoise into here, and the aureolin yellow again. See, I'm letting the paint flood one into another to get these lovely effects of light. There, now the flowers, which we were talking about earlier. Again, I'm going to use the aureolin yellow, but I'm going to use a different sequence this time. So aureolin yellow now is going to go on for these flowers coming up and around here, and I'm going to drop some reds and roses into that to give myself this lovely cool orange reds. Now a little bit of cobalt violet, which is a strange colour I know, but a little bit of cobalt violet into this. My cools coming right up through here. Cobalt violet. Look at the lovely colours we're getting, leaving the white paper sparkling through. Now I'm going to come across to some slightly cooler again, but I'm going to come across to some rose and just drop a little bit of rose into these places for the very cools. Now I want some cadmium orange, it's quite strong. We'll let those come out in the flowers, but you see how now it's gradually building up from cool to warms, letting this cadmium orange now come into these colours here. Cadmium orange coming right out through here, right up here, out and near to that lamp, to warmer colours. Doesn't matter if it's wet into wet in places, still drying off. I still want just these effects of light. I'm going to paint the darks in between later. This is just to get my lights at the moment, remember. There we are. Now some very bright red, some crimson. We'll start dropping a little bit of the reds in to get these very, very warm reds that come out here across, right through. Dropping one colour into another to get a brighter effect than I would as if I was trying to paint them separately. So much stronger reds here. Once I'm on those reds, straight in now up here, the flowers will make them directly red, and a little bit of yellow to go back into there, around some of the edges, just a little bit of warmth. There we are. I can do the difference between the two. Right, we're going to concentrate on the figures a bit more just for the minute. I want to paint her in a bit here, and I want to leave a lot of her as being light. So I'm going to take my cobalt violet again, come right the way around her here, leave a lot of light across her, right down into her arm. This fella back here too. I tend to do this, but I tend to pick up a brush that I think will do for everything, and I tend to just work with that one brush a lot of the time. So I don't necessarily have to change brushes. Right, I'm going to change across now to a small sword. This one. And we'll start dropping in some slightly darker colours. I'm going to take some red now, that bright red we used earlier. Just drop it in here, let it spread a bit, painting wet into wet there. Nice glow to her face. It's more of a glow than you might think, so we'll take some burnt sienna and just drop that in while it's still wet. You can use the brush sideways now here, look. Right down through there. Start to bring some of these warms in here. It's great fun. I mean, that's the purpose of painting, is to have fun, surely. Our foot coming through there. Take some of this warmth that we had, bring it back into here more now. Because I want her face very warm, and his face as well in here, just the same, it's got to be warm, and his hand coming through there. Just indicated with a couple of flicks. That's the beauty of the sword again. Lift out a fraction here and take some of the purple, go back in there with the purple down that side of the face, just letting it drop down a bit. It's the beauty of the sword brush. I can use the brush sideways as a one stroke, or I can use it thinly like that. Again, we'll come back to the warmth here in between on the chest. Just bring in some more that warmth there to get the reflected light. Drop that in. So we want it dark up here, so it's going to be dark behind there, around here. Bit of indigo. And we've got this semi-transparent feeling down here I want to get. So I'll go back to my darks, indigo and a little bit of purple to really get the dark here around her hand. And we can do dry brush with that as well. So I'm going to drag that down, make that darker colour, much darker just in the junction there. Bit of a wash coming through here where the shadow is. I want to move brushes. I'm going to come back to a mop now. I'm going to start using one of my small mops, this one. And I'll take that same colour and use that. You can see I'm using the texture of the paper more now. And I'll take some of this deep blue and purple and a little touch this time of burnt sienna, just to warm it a bit. We'll get some darker colour, just finding her leg there on the edge of the dress, just so we feel that there is something happening within that dress, within that form. Very loose work. So go round again and come back to this figure. I just want to drop in some cobalt violet there again, in and around his arms here, and then I'm going to go to cerulean blue, drop some of this cool blue in, a little bit more warmth there, so we'll take a bit of the burnt sienna, just drop that in there, and then I can take my stronger mix of the Prussian again, just find him sitting in there with his pipe, and just by working darks around that you should be able to find this guy. This old French bloke sitting there outside his shop. When I put the darks around that shortly, we'll bring these salient points out. Right, over here we've got a couple of signs, so we need to put those in. We'll just put the detail like that. Now's the time we've got to do it. Right, now for the very loose work. Still with my round, I'm going to take some light green, sap green, just work a bit of the greens around these leaves up here, ready for putting in lighter work later. I'm sure to start doing some big brush work now. Let's take my hake, a nice 1 inch hake, and I'm going to wet that bit of paper first, just where this goes right through here, and we'll just bring a graduated wash down there, right through these buildings. I'm going to start with a lovely turquoise here, beautiful turquoise, look, straight down through all the way down there. Keep it nice and simple. All the way through here to give one light happening right through that whole lot. Now I'll take some cerulean, just warm it a fraction. We know that watercolour dries lighter than when we put it on, so and I want to be a bit stronger down there, so I'm going to take some ultramarine now. Just let that come down through here while it's still wet. Using the hake only. You can see how I can use it across and quite finely just to indicate stuff at the moment. These warmer colours. We'll bring them out later. More. Big brush. I'm down here now with this big brush. I want to take a lovely golden yellow wash down here, so I'm going to drag that all the way down there. This is cadmium orange. All the way down, leaving some dry, nice dry paper showing through, gleaming through while I'm at it. And we'll take some more of this rich, deep cadmium orange and place that in there. Down to the bush, down below him. I didn't even come into him there. While I've got it on my brush, we'll just start to get some of these areas. Okay, don't worry about dry brush here. Back to my oval mop. I've got a little bit more control there. Oop, darker down there. And remember that we can lift off whenever we want, so we can take that and lift that out if I want to. I can lift out that. Now I'm going to use, I'm deliberately doing this to show you how we can use these different tools, but I can take my magic sponge now and lift out that little bit there. Get the feeling of it. And I can also do the same here where it's stained the paper. I want to lift out down there a bit more now, so I'm just going to use some clean water, come down and just lift out around there, just a little bit around that tower. That's more round brush. And back in with the same dark colour. In fact, I'm going to put a little bit of green with it this time. Just come into these dark windows here. I want these a lot darker. It's still spreading a bit, and I want a nice soft effect of light and indicate all of these balustrades and so on. I'm going to go across here again in a minute and give a bit more depth to that. You see how I'm gradually building up but not painting too much detail, just picking out light. Just to indicate it. I'm going to go stronger down here. Going to come back to my hake again and mix up a nice strong brown to orange again. A little bit of rose into it. And we'll strengthen that again, letting the dry brush do the job so that we get texture of the stone showing through that purple. Slightly sharper at the edge, so I'll push a little bit harder at the edge and to the roof too. And I can break up now I'll just break this up a bit. I can break up the hake just a bit to draw some lines across. You can see how we can use the hake just to flick in some details and textures. pull things together just a little more. The same here, a bit more warmth in that building. Darken it down a bit, take it down through. Now we're almost ready to start on our real darks now. Before I do that, I'm just going to drop in some green here. I want a bit more sparkle, so we'll just let it come up and through. And we can bring some of that green down into the wall to link it. Right, now here we go on some of our darks. I'm going to take some ultramarine, beautiful ultramarine, quite strong. Really whack that in up here. Down to those flowers. Down below there a bit. A bit darker in there as well. And you remember we can use this edge of this brush to get texture and drawing too. Right down through here. Now I'm using the hake as a dry brush. Work into these greens, the shadows here. Coming through now behind this lamp. You can texture into that, twisting the brush. Now we're going to start doing some texturing deliberately. So I'm going to take one of my texture brushes and flatten it out into this colour. Flatten it out into my ultramarine and deliberately start to texture in with it. Just to give you an idea of how we can use all of these different brushes for different purposes, which is what I was asked to show, why I've got different brushes, what my favourites are and why. There we go, like that. Quite a large amount of texturing going on there. Want us to indicate some fencing going down here. Come back with my mop this time, because it's a little bit finer in the work I'm doing. And we'll just start to drop in these shadows under here. You can use the end of the mop to flick fine lines in, look. Right, I'm going to go deeper still. I'm going to take some Prussian blue, brown, and a bit of purple. Really dropping some darks here now. I'm going to go darker still in just a moment. Down there, a little bit of light shine through. Don't take all your lights out, so a bit more brown, a bit more purple there. I want quite a strong warm. Coming into here, it's a lovely strong warm now. Bits of stonework coming out, and I can start to texture in amongst this wet into wet. Much bluer up here, so more of the indigo. Very dark just there. We'll do that twice there in a moment. Indicate down there for the shadows. So how we can use these different brushes for different purposes, and isn't it lovely, just loosely. Now I start to pick out some of the details here. I'm going to pick up my rigger now. I'm rushing ahead a bit, but just to show you, take my rigger with this very dark, and let's just indicate in how this pathway comes up here. We can indicate these stones a bit, just draw around them just a little bit in the pavement. So how each different brush makes a different sort of mark. Now back to my mop again, and back to my texture brush now. I'll take the same dark, the brown and the indigo, and we'll just go back in there trying to get some of these darks going back in here now. Now the Matthew Palmer one. Let's see what he can do on texture on these bushes. And you see how we can come back in now and add a bit of texturing in there. Back into here I can do it a lot stronger yet. Little touch of green into there too. Get some darks going on. Don't want too many textures. I mean, actually I would normally prefer not to have too much texture, in fact, and to keep this a little bit more, a little bit looser. You can see how we can make quite a quick painting by using lights to darks. Again, we come back to the ultramarine and the shadows here. Perhaps a little bit more purple in. Come to my round brush. We need to just touch up some of these darks and details. Don't want to overdo it, just want to bring out these shadows a bit more warmth just into these shadows down here. Just a little touch here and there. Now a bit of dry brush work on those, so just drag that through some ground and dry it out on the bottom of the canvas and just drag across a little bit. Now we haven't used the flat brushes for that, so I'm going to take one of my flats and just drag that here and there. I think I'd like this still a bit stronger yet. I'm not quite happy with that yet. Be brave, be brave. Down through there as well. Right, now you're going to go back with some of the whites and just touch up some of these bits of bright colour that we've lost behind in a moment. First of all, I'll just look at this figure here. It's got a little bit lost now. Right, we'll let that dry a second, and then we'll just put some sparkle back in. Before I do the whites, I'm just going to take a bit of red and my chrome yellow and just try and get some of these roses back into here that have disappeared a bit, because they are so important. They're bound to sink a bit again yet, but we'll just have a go. They just give that lift to the whole thing, don't they? So some nice cadmium orange and some red here. And we'll just pick out these lovely red flowers. Maybe bring a bit more oranges back into him in the shadows there. Right, now I want to be coming back in with the whites just a little to pick up on these highlights. I know where I need them. Can always make them a bit warmer if I need to. I've already left the highlights quite well, but I just want a little bit here and there. Got little bits of light just dragging across, and I'm going to use the stiffness, the texture of the paper now, just to bring out some of the light just back across here. You see, I'm just dragging the brush across it just to give myself a bit of light texture, using the brightness of the paper again to bring it back. Right, with the small round brush, just want to do a little bit of fine work around the lady. Take a little bit of cobalt, and I just want to find her shoulder a bit more there. There's a slightly delineating line just around her shoulder, so I want to just bring out. I'm going to just tidy up some of these edges and finish her off. with a little bit of detail at the end, very end now. And that's about it, I think. Don't think we need any more than that, it'll do it. Just to give you an idea of how we can use these different brush techniques in here. There we go. And then it can be nice to see the work mounted at the end, can't it?